Everything happened so quickly, it's hard to recount every detail, but I'll try my best. Last week, my girlfriend Anne and I had made plans to visit her parents. They live a few hours away, on the other end of the state. We usually don't get out very often. Anne and I spend the majority of our time working. We are both quite passionate about our careers, and as a result, rarely find the time for friends and family. We've missed quite a few holidays and get-togethers over the years. This past week, on a random coincidence, our days off happened to perfectly align for us to have 3 days off together. We could have always taken time off from work for holidays and such, but we wanted to save our days for a special occasion, and for emergencies. So it came as a welcome surprise when we both noticed the alignment. Anne immediately suggested that we visit her parents during the time off, while I suggested we just stay in for the week and relax. Guess who won that debate? After it was decided, Anne spent the day chatting with her mother on the phone about the visit, and to say she was thrilled would be an understatement. We spent the night before packing a couple overnight bags for the few days. I had finished packing my bag by around 7 p.m., and Anne didn't finish packing until 7 a.m. Not to say she stayed up all night packing, she's just very indecisive on a lot of things, and ended up repacking her bag in the morning. After she was finished, I loaded up the car and we began our 3-hour car ride. The first hour of the journey was quite uneventful. We had to pass through our own city and get on the highway that cut through the rural part of the state. Once we had made it onto the highway, it was supposed to be smooth sailing, but that ended up not being the case. Everything was fine until the snow began to fall. It was slight at first. Then, within minutes, we could barely see a foot in front of the car. The snow battered the windshield relentlessly. Anne asked me if we should pull over and wait out the weather, but I told her not to worry. I had driven through worse storms before, and they'd usually pass within a few minutes of driving. Anne just gave me an unsure glance, but trusted my judgment. The storm wasn't letting up, but I was still adamant on continuing the trip. Anne turned to look at me, the same worried expression still on her face. She managed to give me a faint smile, and that's when it happened. I glanced over at her, and saw her face shift from a smile to a look of panic, as a pair of headlights attached to an 18-wheeler filled the windshield. An ear-splitting sound filled the car as glass shattered all around us. The sounds of rending metal and squealing tires filled the air. A sudden impact to my chest knocked me back in my seat, as the car began to roll off the road into a nearby ditch. Our car came to a rest, upside down on a snowy bank. I could feel a trickle of warm blood run up my neck towards my face. I struggled to keep my eyes open. I couldn't look at anything aside from Anne hanging there in the seat next to me, motionless. I reached out to grab her hand, but before I could make it, I lost consciousness. The next thing I remember was the incessant buzzing of the hospital lights overhead. The rocking of the gurney as I was wheeled down hallways. I could feel pressure on my chest, and as my eyes drifted down, I saw a large chunk of metal sticking out of my body. The buzzing of the lights began to fade as a cacophony of urgent hospital sounds took its place. I remember asking where my girlfriend was, if she was all right. The nurses just told me to remain calm and to lie back. I was brought into the operating room and the lights overhead were blinding, even with my eyes shut. Although the doctors were muttering quietly amongst themselves, I heard one of them mention heart repair. Then, a shrill beep filled the room, and I passed out. I opened my eyes a moment later. I found myself standing in the operating room, looking at the masked doctors all around me. I asked them what had happened, but they didn't acknowledge me. That's when I noticed how slow all of the doctors were moving. as if time were almost standing still. I looked over the shoulder of one of the doctors and saw my face lying there on the table. I chuckled to myself as I finally realized what was happening. This whole entire situation looked like some cheesy scene in a medical TV show. That's when I felt a twinge of unease wash over me, and I felt like I was being watched. I looked around the room, trying to make sure I was alone. Then I saw it. There was a face sticking through one of the walls on the far side of the operating room. Its skin was white as bone. It had a very sharp chin and a pointed nose. Stringy white hair dangled down the sides of its face. Its eyes, however, were shut for some reason. I took a step back and watched as the rest of its body began to pass through the wall. Two disturbingly long arms entered first. They reminded me of limbs of a spider. Bony hands with fingernail-like knives rested on the sterilized floor. They scraped across the floor as it pulled the rest of its body through. Its torso was thin, like this thing hadn't eaten in years. Its legs were the last to follow. Two spindly appendages nearly as long as its arms stepped through the wall. By the time this thing was fully in the operating room, it was taking up half of it. It then dragged its body over to me lying on the table and hovered its face directly above mine. Its hands gripped the edges of the table, bending them slightly. Then, its mouth began to open. Teeth like an eel filled this thing's mouth. Rows and rows of thin, sharp needles. Its jaw began to dislocate and descend onto my unconscious face. Unsure of what to do, I shouted. The creature reeled back and turned its head towards me, its mouth closing in the process. Its eyes were still shut. The way it tilted its head as its attention was now fixed upon me instead of my body on the table was unsettling. It dragged one of its arms forward, and it landed right next to my feet. Then it pulled its body over to me. Before it could bring its face to mine, my instincts forced my legs to run. I ran through the hospital, down the stairs, and out of the exit. As I ran down the street, I noticed that the sky was empty and dark. There wasn't a single star in the sky. I slowed down and looked back to make sure whatever that thing wasn't following me anymore. But when I did, I ran into something and was knocked to the ground. Somehow, this thing had gotten in front of me. It loomed over my head. I tried to get up, but it rested its massive hand upon my chest, pinning me to the ground. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. My chest was getting tighter and tighter. The creature lowered its face inches away from mine. Then, it opened its eyes. Its eyes were black, with white dots all over it. They looked like the missing stars from the sky. My instincts were telling me not to look at them, but I couldn't look away. A mix of peace and fear, happiness and sorrow were overwhelming me. So much, in fact, that I almost didn't notice its teeth growing closer and closer to my face. Just before the needles entered my flesh, I opened my eyes and found myself lying in a hospital bed, sweat dripping from my body. Anne was sitting next to me holding my hand. She told me how worried she was, and how glad she was that I was all right. Once I realized where I was, I tried to calm myself down. I asked her what had happened, and she explained the car accident to me. As she told me, flashbacks of seeing her body in the car filled my mind. I asked her if she was all right, and she said that the initial impact knocked her out. Because she was unconscious, her body didn't sustain as much damage as me. She told me that the guy driving the semi-truck was pretty banged up too, but he managed to remain conscious and called the police. She went on to tell me that a large piece of metal had punctured my chest, and that the doctors had to go in and surgically repair my heart. She told me they had to stop my heart for 6 minutes to fix it. Anne then commented on how pale I was and asked me if everything was all right. I shook my head and I told her I was fine. The doctor entered, remarking on how pleased he was to see that I was awake. He stated that they wanted to keep me at the hospital for a few days, just to monitor me, but then he'd said I'd be free to go. I'm not sure if what I experienced that day was just a freak nightmare or some kind of hallucinogen brought on by the medication. But ever since that day, I see that face everywhere I go. Behind me in every mirror, peeking around every corner. I can't escape it. It's even worse when I sleep. Its face is directly in front of mine during the dream. Its eyes remained closed, and only when they start to open do I wake up. I have no idea if the thing I keep seeing is real or not. If it's not, then hopefully some medication can help me with the hallucinations. But if it is real, then I have a whole new reason to be afraid of death. And so do you. I remember the call as if it happened an hour ago. Child, male, taken in the middle of the night by an unknown assailant, 3 a.m. My partner and I happened to be in the area when the call came through. My partner sipped his coffee as I turned on the lights and drove over to the location. We arrived at the destination roughly 15 minutes later. I stepped out of the car into the frigid night air and looked at the house. Everything seemed quiet. Then, the front door of the house burst open, and a middle-aged woman ran out into the snow towards us. She was in hysterics, screaming frantically for us to get her baby back. My partner sighed as I tried to calm the woman down. He wasn't sighing out of boredom, but more so annoyance. We've encountered missing persons cases before, and every single time, there was a mindless family member screaming in our faces. I know that dealing with a situation like this is extremely traumatic, but when you've become so worked up that you can't even think straight, well, that doesn't help anybody. After about 10 minutes of assurances, I was finally able to calm the woman down. I asked her if we could go inside the house to talk. She sniffled quietly and nodded as the wind battered against us. We stepped inside the house and I asked the woman to sit before asking the general questions. Her name was Joyce Madison. She's a realtor and a single mother of 1. She called regarding her 10-year-old son, Peter Madison. She began explaining how this all started. I nodded to my partner to begin examining the house. Apparently, Peter has been having some problems over the last few months or so. She told me that one day she was awoken to the screams of her son. Joyce jumped from her bed and ran to check on Peter. She found him sitting in his bed, crying. When she asked him what was wrong, Peter told her that he had seen a face staring at him through the window. Joyce hardly believed it, but still, like a good mother, thoroughly examined the window, peering deep into the snowy night. After finding nothing out of the ordinary, she suggested to Peter that it might have just been a nightmare. This went on for 3 months. Every so often, at least once a week, Peter would claim he saw someone outside his window and would scream for his mother. She would wake up, check the surroundings, and find nothing there. Worried for his mental health, Joyce eventually scheduled a therapist for Peter. During the last 2 weeks, Peter didn't seem to have any nightmares according to his mother. She'd wake up, make breakfast, Peter would come downstairs. She would ask him how he slept, and he would simply reply with, "Fine." Joyce thought the therapy was helping Peter. Well, that was until tonight. She was awoken about an hour ago to the frantic screams of her son. When she realized what was happening, she got out of bed, rubbed her eyes, and walked over to her son's room. She opened the door and found that her son's window was broken open, and that her son wasn't in his bed. She immediately called the police shortly after. I nodded as I jotted down the information into my notepad, and I once again assured her that we will do everything in our power to find Peter. I joined my partner, who was already in Peter's room, looking around. The window was forced open, like somebody had pushed it from the outside. The bed next to the window was a disheveled mess. I clicked on the flashlight and leaned my head out of the window. At the base of the window was a pair of large footprints, but they seemed off. They weren't tracks left by someone wearing shoes, that's for sure. They were large and pointed at the ends, possibly belonging to an animal, but that didn't make any sense. The large tracks led away from the window into the darkness of the woods near the house. My partner looked at me and shook his head. He didn't have to say anything. I knew the chances of finding the boy were growing slimmer by the second. Regardless, we walked out of the house and followed the tracks to the edge of the woods. I called out to Peter, but there was no response. The footprints led into the brush and we followed. The woods surrounding the town were extremely dense, even in the middle of the winter. Trees seemed to grow right on top of one another. We tried our best to follow the tracks, but they were becoming sparser, as if whatever this thing was had increased its pace. We followed them for another 15 minutes before the tracks suddenly stopped. We called out to Peter once again, shining our flashlights all around us in the process. There was absolutely no sign of him or whoever it was that had taken him. Over the following days, we organized multiple search parties for Peter. We scoured most of the forest, at least the sectors near Peter's house. We spent so much time out there, in fact, that some of our searchers were starting to become ill. During those days, I paid a visit to Peter's therapist. Peter's therapist, a woman by the name of Dr. Betty Warner, was shocked by my arrival. I inquired about Peter's sessions, and she was reluctant to tell me about them. However, after I informed her that any potential information could help locate Peter, she was more understanding. She told me that Peter was hallucinating a monster, staring at him from outside his window at night. I let her know that I was fully aware that he was seeing something about once a week from his mother. The therapist shook her head and informed me it wasn't once a week. It was every single night over the last few months. Every single night, something would be standing outside Peter's window and would be watching him. I wasn't sure what to say, but she continued. She said that the reason Peter would scream on those nights were a result of whatever it was trying to open his window. He said that most nights it would just stand there and watch him, not moving an inch. He spoke fondly of those nights because after an hour or so, the thing would leave and he could get some sleep. The other nights, the ones where the thing would press against the window, causing it to creak and groan under the pressure, were the nights he'd scream for his mother. I asked Dr. Warner if Peter ever described what this thing looked like. She paused briefly and said he only described it once in all of the sessions they've had. He said it was tall, taller than his window. He said it had to bend down just to look inside. Its body was covered in long black fur. At first, he thought it might have been Bigfoot. Then, he saw its face. Bone, yellowish white, like one of the skulls you'd see in the desert, in a cartoon. He said it would watch him without moving, but on some nights, it would raise a large clawed hand and press on the window. Even though I had a hard time believing Dr. Warner, I made notes and nodded politely. A costume, perhaps. It's possible. I asked why Peter had stopped screaming during the last 2 weeks. The doctor thought for a moment and speculated that he might have started realizing that it was all in his head. After 2 weeks of searching for Peter, we eventually called it off. There was absolutely no sign of the boy, anywhere. This absolutely devastated Mrs. Madison. She resented the town and the police station for failing in our duties to find the boy. A few days had passed since we called off the search. My partner and I were out on our nightly patrol, discussing the case when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a bear, walking on its hind legs in the dark. It was skirting along the nearby tree line. My partner was in mid-sentence when I slammed on the brakes. I turned on the searchlight, panning it over to where I last saw it. I quickly got out of my car and dashed over to the woods. My partner tried calling out to me, but his voice was fading in the distance. I ran through the woods, twigs and snow crunching beneath my feet. It wasn't long until I found a set of similar tracks like the ones from before. I pushed further into the brush. Then, I stopped. Not because the tracks stopped, but because I found what was leaving them. I stared at it as it lumbered away from me. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I called out to it, demanding that it stop. It did. It slowly turned towards me. Its frame was intimidating. I looked up at it, and its face was exactly as described, like the rotting carcass of an animal for a face. Upon seeing this, I drew my firearm and aimed at this creature. It took a step towards me. The ground shook slightly underneath this thing's weight. I fired. The gunshots reverberated throughout the forest. It raised its hand as if to shield itself from the bullets. When my gun ran out, it roared. It took a step towards me and in one swift motion, swung at me with its massive clawed hand. The impact sent me flying into a nearby tree. I awoke to my partner standing over me, talking into his radio. I looked around and noticed that I was no longer in the woods. Apparently, he had found me and dragged me out of there. He said he was calling me an ambulance, and I told him not to worry about it. I was banged up, sure, but nothing to go to the hospital for. He asked me what happened in the woods after I ran in there. I just couldn't seem to find the words to answer him. I just stared at the darkened, lifeless trees in front of me. It's been about a week since that day, and 3 weeks since Peter had gone missing. My partner and I were once again driving around town early in the morning when we got a call regarding another missing child on the other side of town. My partner gave me an unsure glance for a brief moment. We both sat there staring at the radio. I wanted to pick it up. I really did. But something inside of me was telling me that I got lucky last time. That I wouldn't get a second chance. As I hovered my hand over the radio, another car responded to the call. And I'm ashamed to admit, as an officer, I was happy that it wasn't us. I have more questions than answers regarding the case of Peter Madison. Like what that thing even was, or where it came from, or why it's only interested in children. But I know two things for sure. One, whatever it was, it definitely wasn't wearing a costume. And two, it took 7 bullets at point-blank range and still managed to attack me. I don't know what happened to young Peter Madison, but I'm not sure I want to find out. I am a fire watcher. Upon moving into my station, I found the following pages typed on my desk. I am not the author of the following. I am transcribing exactly what I found. Dated 1989. I've been located here for 185 days, according to my calendar. I'm stationed up in the northwest of the United States with 2 other guys. Clark, and Thomas. 185 days. That's 5 days longer than our stint here should have been. Normally, they rotate us out every 180 days. We were supposed to be picked up by helicopter 5 days ago, but it still hasn't come. I started writing this logbook, journal, whatever, because we're overdue for our evac. Or so we think. Maybe we messed up the calendar somehow. It's possible. Our main radio stopped working on day 179.
Get up! I see smoke!
Bleary-eyed, I saw Clark standing over my bunk. I could see the orange slits of light reflecting on his torso, signaling to me that it was the early morning.
Come on, Teddy, get up! Smoke!
Smoke, huh? I said, still half delirious.
Yeah, smoke. A really small stream of it, maybe a mile southeast.
His eyes were wide and brighter than the sunlight on his uniform. I pulled myself out of the bottom bunk and wandered over towards the window. I didn't even need my binoculars to see the small sliver of smoke creating a shadow in the early sun's light. In 185 days, it's only the second time we've seen a potential fire. For those of you who don't know what a fire watch tower looks like, it's basically a wooden cabin, elevated about 100 feet in the air. Ours has a staircase that wraps around the structure beneath the cabin. I'm pretty sure other towers use ladders, but that's besides the point. Clark and I bunk up in the watchtower. We have a small little kitchen, our bunk bed, and a 360-degree view of nothing but woods. Thomas sleeps in the tiny little cabin at the base of our tower, which is also where our main office is. Office may be too loose of a term. It's one desk and a typewriter used for typing out reports of what we see out here. I rubbed my eyes and looked over to Clark. All right then, let's go check it out.
No way, Teddy. Are you crazy?
He replied immediately. Clark has been afraid to go out past the outhouse since day 180 passed. He's afraid that a helicopter will come, and he'll miss his chance to be rescued. Rescued, Clark would say. But are we in danger? Did we miscalculate the number of days we've been out here? We still have plenty of food. Did they forget about us? Has the apocalypse come and gone and we don't know because we've been so isolated? Okay, fine, you big baby, I said. Radio down to Thomas and let him know. He should be awake by now. Our main radio back to base isn't getting any sign of life from anywhere. And if it isn't receiving from anywhere, we assume that we aren't being heard from anywhere. Luckily, we still have our own short-range walkie-talkies to communicate with each other. Clark took out his walkie. The crackling static filled the tower before he pressed the button.
Tom. Hey, Tom. There's some smoke about a mile southeast. Can you go check it out?
A few seconds passed before Thomas responded.
After I finish wiping my ass, I'll go check it out. Unless you want to come down here and help me with that, eh, Clarky?
Thomas, the oldest of us, was always picking on Clark, the youngest. He doesn't really dislike Clark, it's just he's easy to pick on. He's a 23-year-old college dropout. I think he studied accounting or finance or something on his parents' dime. I don't think he left college to be a professional fire watcher. No, I think he left to come out into the wilderness, to be alone, and to take a retrospective look at his life to decide what he really wants to do. You only sign up for 180 days of isolation if you're crazy, or if you want to get away from something. I'm not too sure which category Thomas falls in. He's a cryptic brute of a man. His picture is probably in the dictionary next to lumberjack. He's pretty quiet unless he has a joke to tell or something important to say. Either way, when he opens his mouth, I listen. As for me, well, it's not really important why I'm out here.
Heading out now, Clarky.
Thomas radioed. Clark and I watched Thomas begin his trek into the tree line until we could no longer see him. Clark cocked his head towards mine.
Teddy,
He said to me.
Thomas has been acting different, weird.
I didn't expect him to be so blunt, but I had noticed as well. I knew Clark was aware of it, but this was the first time we actually spoke about it. I'm aware, I replied curtly.
He doesn't seem to be bothered that we're stuck out here,
Clark mentioned. We don't know if we are stuck out here. We could have scratched the dates off wrong. You know, like we thought we didn't scratch a day off yet, but we really did. So we accidentally scratched off the next day too, I reasoned.
Yeah, I guess,
Clark said softly. I knew what he was going to say next.
At night, though,
he whispered. Would you give it a rest, Clark?
Come on, Teddy. It's messed up. He's fine during the day and then just, what, changes? Does he have some type of an illness? It happens so suddenly.
Maybe he does. So what if the guy goes out at night to stare at trees? I joked.
Trees? Stare at trees?
Clark questioned. I know you've seen it. He goes out near the tree line and stands there for a while looking out, sometimes for hours. Maybe he does have a screw loose, and maybe he shouldn't be out here. But I don't think it's the best idea to bring it up to him when we are trapped out here with him, especially if he is insane. Silence fell between us before Clark responded.
I didn't know he stares out at the forest,
he said to me in a soft voice, and eyes wider than when he woke up this morning. Oh. Wait, what? What were you going to say?
At night,
he stammered.
He comes up the stairs.
I looked over to our half-open door leading out into the staircase, letting a cool breeze in. What? What?
He comes up the stairs and just looks at us, stares at us through the windows.
Thomas left to go check out the smoke about an hour ago. The smoke seems to have vanished, so I figured he handled it. Clark spends his days using our walkie-talkies, trying every station possible to alert anyone nearby. I just watch the forest. It's 11:30 p.m. Thomas isn't back. He left at about 7 a.m. He hasn't answered his radio. Tomorrow will be day 186. We do not know if Thomas is okay, and one of us will more than likely have to go check the woods tomorrow. And since Clark is a big old scaredy cat, it'll probably end up being me. More disturbing, though, is what Clark told me a few minutes ago, and it's the reason I went down to the office to type this. I was leaned back in the swivel chair, spinning slowly, making sure there were no lights or fires in the dark expanse of trees, and wondering where Thomas was. He must have been hurt. Even if he was lost, he'd reply on his walkie. We always answered our walkies. They're with us at all times, even when we're using the can or showering. Clark stopped my chair mid-spin and mid-thought. Before I could protest and ask what the hell he was doing, he spoke.
Listen, I need to tell you something I've been thinking about recently. It's eating away at me.
I wondered if this had to do with Thomas. Okay, Clark, I said. I'm all ears.
Look, it's going to sound crazy,
he warned. I bet I've heard crazier, I said, trying to put him at ease. He took a long yet stuttered inhale, then spoke.
I don't remember coming out here.
My facial expression didn't change, and it looked like he was waiting for a reaction, so he repeated what he said once more.
I don't remember coming out here. Do you? Do you remember applying for this job? Do you remember being interviewed? Or even being flown out here?
At first, I was almost amused. Then, as he asked those questions, I froze. I didn't remember. He continued.
You know how I said I decided to leave college? Well, now that I'm thinking about it harder, I don't know if I did. I mean, I must have, right? To be out here? I must have. But all I can remember is my last day of class for the semester. And then I was here. I don't remember anything between coming home after class and meeting you and Thomas.
I was listening to Clark, but it probably didn't show. I was still, expressionless, motionless. I couldn't remember coming out here. I've tried, and I'm still trying. Thomas is missing in the woods. Clark and I are losing our minds or something else. Either way, I can't explain it yet.
There are more pages scattered about, but I haven't figured out the order yet. Some are ripped, and some are faded beyond recognition. But there is a more pressing and imminent problem at hand. About 30 minutes ago, I met Gary and Harold. We have been stationed out here for the next 180 days. I don't know whether or not to tell them about what I found. And I don't know whether or not to tell them that I don't remember coming out here.
Tinnitus, a nightmare of a disease affecting millions of people, myself included. How could I best describe this condition? An incessant nail-on-a-chalkboard screeching that goes on for every minute of every day. Just imagine to never experience the true bliss of utter silence. Maybe it's not too uncommon to hear a vague ringing, especially for people like me, growing up to be an obnoxious teenager with no regard for volume control. Understandably, my parents were not happy about me blasting loud music at all hours of the day. But what kind of teenage rebel would I have been if I listened to my parents? Ultimately, my punishment would be given years later when I started hearing a faint ringing. At first, it was a rare occurrence, but at present day, I can't even fall asleep without the aid of a loud white noise-producing machine. But even then, my quality of rest is debatable at best. During the early days, I was willing to try any ailment to stop the godforsaken noise. Rainstorms while sleeping, earwax removal, and even a small dose of antidepressants. Nothing worked. You'd be amazed how many help groups you can find online. Forums for anything. Veterans with PTSD, how to cope with losing a pet, or in my case, how to deal with tinnitus. I had looked over the top suggestions on several occasions. Most I had already tried while visiting my doctor, while the rest were mostly scams more suited for multi-level marketing campaigns. I used to call myself an optimist, so naturally I would return to the forum every other week in hopes of finding a miracle cure. On one particular day, I decided to scroll a bit further down and see the less popular suggestions. Among the obvious troll posts and scam cures, I found a more clickbaity post that read, "A weird trick to cure tinnitus. Nothing more, nothing less." I sighed and decided to give it a shot, preparing myself to be disappointed yet again. But the instructions were simple enough. Place your palms on your ears and direct your fingers to the back of your head. Put your index fingers on top of your middle fingers and try to snap them, like a drum. Repeat 50 to 100 times. There were no comments below as the post was relatively new. Worst case, I would look stupid sitting there by myself and drumming on the back of my head. So I tried it out. I snapped my fingers, causing a little drumming sensation on the back of my head. 47, 48, 49, 50. That ought to do it. I removed my palms from my ears and listened intently. Nothing. For the first time in years, there was just the pure bliss of silence. For minutes, I just sat back in awe, not believing what I was hearing, or more accurately, not hearing. Had this random trick actually worked? I decided that rather than enjoying my newfound silence, I would give my brain a well-earned silent rest. And that's exactly what I did. I slept like a baby that night, until around 2 in the morning. I tend to wake up randomly during the night anyway, so it was little cause for concern. To my disappointment, but not surprise, the screeching had returned. I half expected the solution to be a temporary one at best anyway. I simply performed the witchcraft-like trick and the ringing was gone without a trace again. With a sigh of relief, I settled back into bed. The sound that had haunted me for so long had been easily defeated by a helpful anonymous person online, and I was content. I only then realized that I wasn't enveloped in complete silence. There was something else cowering in the dark, only letting its presence known by a soft thud. Could it be my own heartbeat? After all these years, would I be haunted by a new sound? I held 3 fingers on the side of my neck and felt my pulse. It didn't match the sound in the darkness. Although I tried, placing the sound proved to be a challenge. With each passing thud, I tried to localize it a bit more. I went as far as opening every cupboard in my apartment, checked in the hallways, and lastly, placed my ear against the wall. No sooner did my ear hit the wall before the sound stopped. My heart raced alongside my logical mind. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe it was a leaky pipe or one of my neighbors being loud. No matter the cause, I put it out of my mind and went back to bed. In the morning, the ringing returned. I figured I could put the noise at bay by performing the trick every 6 hours. It quickly became a routine of mine to stupidly tap my head when no one was looking. But it worked. Everything was great, apart from my nightly routine of waking up around 2 a.m. and hearing the same thumping, softly keeping me company in the darkness. Most nights I simply ignored it, but other nights curiosity got the better of me, and I pursued the sound. Each night was another failure to locate the sound. I couldn't place it, and I couldn't bother keeping myself up long enough to figure out when it started and when it ended. I talked to my neighbors, but they denied being up at such late hours. Rats were another option that crossed my mind, but after a quick visit by pest control, they assured me that there were no rats living within my walls. In fact, after looking at the building plans, they insisted that it would be impossible for rats to live inside these walls. As a last resort, I decided I would record myself sleeping. I had heard there were a bunch of apps that only record if there's a noise, so I figured it would be ideal for the situation I was in. I downloaded a free recording app and went to bed. Just like every other night, I woke up around 2 a.m., but decided I would ignore the sound and let my phone do its work. I had some earplugs that came in handy, and without further troubles, I fell back asleep. After waking up the following morning, I brewed myself a much-needed cup of joe and sat down, figuring I could put all the recording into an editing software and look at the amplitude, rather than listening through it all. The thumps began around midnight, and continued for several hours. Other than that, I found mostly sounds of myself tossing and turning around in bed. However, at 3:30 a.m. there was a short pause consisting of complete silence, as if every sound had been erased from existence. It was not more than a minute before the sound returned, but it wasn't a soft thumping anymore. It sounded more like whispering, just incomprehensible voices talking to no one in particular. I couldn't make out what was said on the recording. My phone isn't exactly a technological wonder. In fact, I had no interest in finding out. If anything, I would have preferred to leave the apartment and forget about the whole thing, but being a poor student without any nearby family, I had no other option than to stay put. After some hesitation, I came to the ridiculous conclusion that if I could hear the actual whispering, I could probably locate the source. So when night came, I went to bed, fully expecting to be awoken at the same usual time, and from then I would search for the noise. 2 a.m. rolled around and I was awoken by the familiar yet eerie thumping. It had turned from an intriguing part of my nightly routine to a dreaded enemy. It was relentless, not stopping for a single second, and as before, I had trouble locating the exact location. Somehow it managed to echo throughout my room like an auditory illusion. At precisely 3:31 a.m., the sound abruptly stopped. I held my breath in anticipation, waiting for whatever voice to start talking. The whispers began, and unlike the thumps, I could immediately tell its origin. It came from the wall directly behind my bed. I knew there couldn't possibly exist anything behind that wall. No apartment nor crawl space. Just a concrete barrier separating my room from the outside world. I crawled onto my bed with cautious steps, as if approaching a wild animal, carefully putting my ear against the wall. The whispers started to become more focused, turning into a single understandable phrase.
No, you can finally hear us.
It sounded like several broken voices morphed into a singular entity. I jolted back on my bed, where I remained frozen in fear.
Thank you for letting us in.
The voices continued before falling silent. My head started to feel faint. It took me a while to realize that I hadn't been breathing for quite some time. I forced a gasp, bringing air into my lungs, trying desperately to calm down. While trying to come up with a plan, the thumping returned, only this time I heard exactly where it was coming from. The soft thumps turned into loud pounds along the side of my wall. They moved along the wall, working its way towards the hallway outside my bedroom. I could vaguely make out a shadow beneath the door as it moved past it. I always keep my bedroom door locked, a habit brought with me from living with intruding family members, but I knew that wouldn't stop whatever this was. The creature started knocking on the door and thumping after each knock, the same thump I had become accustomed to over the past few weeks. It spoke to me with a broken voice.
It's too late to lock us out,
they said. What are you? I stuttered back.
We are the acolytes. We wanted to be heard.
It then punched at my door, small cracks appearing around the hinges.
We have always been here.
Another punch on my door, and the upper hinges broke. I would have called the police or anyone for that matter, but I had inconveniently left my phone in my jacket pocket. So instead, I grabbed whatever clothes I had lying on the floor and climbed out of the window using the fire escape. I didn't want to take my chances with that thing. As I climbed down, I heard the door break open above me, but I didn't look back. After escaping, I found a nearby gas station and used their phone to dial the police. Without going into the specifics, I told them that there was an intruder in my apartment, and explained that I had fled down the fire escape. Of course, when they checked the apartment, there was no one to be found. The door to my bedroom was shattered, but I couldn't prove it was a new development in my otherwise messy apartment. They had to break down my front door to get in, and I knew my landlord was going to be pissed, but I didn't really care about that. After a very brief investigation checking the security camera to confirm that no one could possibly have entered my apartment, I was let off with a warning not to prank call the police again with my imaginary problems. Another officer offered a number for a facility that deals in psychiatric issues. While the police were there, I grabbed a bag and filled it with the bare essentials. I left that night to return home to my parents. I'm never going back to that place again. I've called my landlord and explained that they can keep my deposit alongside whatever stuff I left behind. A few days have passed since I left, and my tinnitus has returned louder than ever, but I'm happy about it. By allowing myself to hear the creature, I inadvertently let it in. So I saw it as a bittersweet blessing, to let the tinnitus hide the thing that goes thump in the night. It all started a little over a month ago. I've lived alone in this house for the past year, and up until now, I haven't had any issues. I had first moved to this small town in the middle of the Midwest a year ago after my job had to relocate me. I'm a factory manager, and I oversee the daily operations of a newly built factory on the outskirts of town. The moving part sucked, but once I was finally settled in, and took a moment to view my surroundings, I was awestruck. The beauty of this town was simply breathtaking. I was never much of a nature guy. I spent most of my youth in a major city. But seeing the towering trees that wrapped around the entire town like a protective barrier made me feel safe. The intimidating mountains that formed the backdrop of our town were just as impressive. They gave the horizon character. It was truly a sight to behold. After around 10 months of living here, my company was opening up a new plant and they asked me if I could go oversee operations once again. However, this time I declined. I asked if I could stay on as the permanent manager to this location. They mentioned a slight pay decrease, but I didn't mind. Over the past year, everything was perfect. I'd wake up at around 6 a.m., do my daily morning ritual, stop by the local cafe which serves probably the best coffee on the planet, and be at work by 8 a.m. My job at the factory was quite simple. I was basically a glorified babysitter. I'd deal with discrepancies, do gratuitous amounts of paperwork, check in with my supervisors, and finally head home around 6 p.m. My job probably sounds very tedious and boring to a lot of you, but I still enjoy it. Plus, even with a pay cut, I was still making a pretty decent salary. I'm sure most of you aren't here to listen to me talk about my job or this town, however. At the beginning of last month, I caught a glimpse of something out in my backyard. The way my house is set up, my backyard butts right up to the surrounding tree line that encompasses the town. I had just gotten home from my job and was lying in bed watching some TV until around 10 p.m. When I was finally getting ready to go to sleep, I turned off the TV as well as my nightstand lamp. I had rolled over and was facing my bedroom window now, which pointed directly out into my backyard. It had snowed a few days prior, so my entire backyard had a thin layer of untouched snow. I was staring out of the window, letting my mind wander as I was beginning to drift off to a peaceful slumber, when I saw the flash of something near the tree line. Seeing whatever it was made my mind refocus itself as I scanned the trees outside. Not 5 minutes later, I saw them. 2 eyes were shining in the tree line, reflecting light from some unknown source. They would bob up and down for a moment, before stopping and staring at my house. They would then turn to the right or left, disappear for a minute or two, then reappear at a different spot. At first, I thought it might have been a wolf or perhaps some other nocturnal creature foraging for food. I put it out of my thoughts and fell asleep. For the entire week straight, those eyes had become sort of a routine for me, as they appeared every night in the same exact spot. I would lie awake and watch them intently. I thought that perhaps the area in the trees was some sort of natural grazing spot, that whatever animal this was had become accustomed to eating here every night. I watched as the eyes walked left to right, disappeared and reappeared, until my tired eyes could no longer stay open. At the end of the first week, however, something happened. I had just finished turning off the TV and had rolled over to wait for the animal to arrive. A half hour passed, and I was just about to go to sleep when the eyes appeared. The eyes shined brightly in between the dark trees. After a few moments, the eyes seemed to get closer to my house. They were faintly growing in the distance. Then, once it crossed into the threshold into my backyard, my motion sensor lights I had set up on the back of my house went off. My eyes shot wide open, and I felt my heart rate slowly start to increase as I saw what was standing in my backyard. It looked like a man. Well, almost a man. It was hunched over on all fours like a dog. Its skin was bluish gray. Stringy black hair clung to its scalp like the legs of a spider. Its eyes were massive, taking up most of its face. The sudden bright light caused it to raise a hand to shield its eyes. Its fingers were disturbingly long, like bony sticks hovering over its face. The thing fell back and scrambled into the dark trees. After watching the event unfold, there was no way I was going back to bed after that. I got up from my bed and looked around my backyard. A few moments later, and the motion sensor lights diminished. I continued scanning the trees for any sign of this creature, but it was gone. I spent the rest of the night trying to find any information I could on what I had seen. I searched countless websites, putting in the description of what I saw. Most of them spoke of ghosts and demons, but this didn't seem like a demon to me. It looked like a very real thing in my backyard. Other websites mentioned various mythical creatures that had some similarities, but not much information regarding them. The following week, I watched my window every single night in case it came back. But every single night, I was met with nothing. I was starting to think that what I saw wasn't even real. That I had fallen asleep while watching the trees and that my mind had crafted this vivid nightmare. At the beginning of last week, however, I realized that it wasn't a nightmare. Well, not entirely. It was very real. I was heading to bed a bit later than usual, and as I laid there, I began watching through my window. I wasn't watching as intently as I was from the previous week. Then, after one long blink, it appeared. And this time, my heart thudded in my chest so hard that I thought it was going to stop at any moment. I could feel the air begin to sting my eyes as I hadn't shut them for 2 minutes straight. The reason I was so unnerved was that the creature was lowering its head from directly above the outside of my window. The roof of my house was still a fair distance from the top of my window, so that meant this creature was somehow clinging to the outside of my house, like a spider on a web. It stared into my window at me, our eyes locked in some deranged staring contest. I was wondering why my motion sensor lights hadn't gone off at all, but that thought quickly left my mind as I saw the creature reach its hand towards the glass. It began raking its sharp, jagged fingernails along the glass over and over again. The shrill sound that was produced from it digging its fingers into the glass was maddening. It's embarrassing to admit, but I was cowering at this point. Too scared to think and too scared to move. It pulled its hand away from the window, and with a swift swing, it shattered the glass into pieces. When it did this, I fell back out of bed and onto the floor. I wanted to get up, to run out of there screaming my head off, but I couldn't seem to take my eyes off of the creature. It slithered its way through the broken window and crawled along the inside of my wall. It stopped once it reached the corner of my bedroom and just stared at me. Its mouth began to crack open as if it hadn't opened its mouth for some time. Broken, sharp, rotted teeth filled its mouth as it seemed to smile at me. A slight feeling of disgust began to form within the overwhelming terror that gripped me. In one rapid movement, the creature lunged from the wall of my bedroom over to me. It grabbed at me with its long fingers while its mouth snapped wildly in my face. I could truly sense that this creature was trying to kill and eat me. While it flailed at me relentlessly, the commotion caused the lamp on my nightstand to topple over. I managed to switch it on with one hand while my other hand held the creature at bay. The sudden light seemed to blind the creature briefly. In that moment, I brought the lamp crashing down onto its head as hard as I could. It slumped over onto its side, and I shoved it off of me. I quickly got up, left the room, and called the police. I explained that a wild animal or something had broken into my house. They arrived shortly after, and I led them through my house into my bedroom. Though, when I opened my bedroom door, the creature was gone. They examined my broken window and realized that I was actually telling the truth. Though, when they asked me to describe what kind of animal it was, I stopped myself from telling them that it was a monster. I told them that I was sleeping and that it was too dark for me to see what it was. They nodded and told me to call them if it ever comes back. That was the beginning of last week, and I have since repaired my window and made sure my motion sensor lights were working properly. I'm not sure what that creature actually is. Maybe some of you out there have more experience with this and might know more. But as for me, well, I think I'm going to contact the higher-ups in my company and ask them if that new manager position is still available. If it is, well then I'll be more than happy to leave this place behind. It all started at the beginning of the month. I was at work, sitting in my cubicle browsing Facebook when my pocket started vibrating. I rubbed my tired eyes as I pulled my attention away from the mindless social media I was absorbing and fished my phone out of my pocket. I glanced down at the device and noticed that I was being called by my favorite person in the entire world. Unknown number. I clicked the tiny button on the side of my phone to silence the intrepid buzzing and focused my attention back on my monitor. Wendy got another A in school. That's nice. Clark was dominating a plate of wings at the local pub. I wonder if they're any good. As I raked my finger along the scroll wheel on my mouse, I was startled by my phone vibrating once more, albeit a shorter buzz, signifying a possible message. I once again pulled my phone out and was disappointed when I read, "One new voicemail," illuminated across my screen. Probably just a lengthy telemarketer proposition, I thought. I set my phone down on my desk and continued working. You might think I'm lazy at my job, and I am. Well, not entirely. I process spreadsheets for a data company, and I must wait for new spreadsheets to be sent to me in order for me to process them. Typically, at the start of my shift, I'm sent quite a few emails containing the data that needs processing for the day, and I'm usually finished with the bulk of it by lunch. Then, over the course of the rest of my shift, I may get 2 to 5 more pieces of data to process, but I knock those out quickly. The rest of the time, I just browse the internet, waiting for my shift to come to an end. Hell, my boss doesn't even care, so long as I get my work done and I do it correctly. Once the clock struck 6, I grabbed my bag, my phone, and saluted my boss as I passed by his office. He returned a slight nod and I headed down to my car. Sitting in my car, I pulled out my phone and tapped on my call button, navigating to my voicemails. My phone has a cool feature that will automatically attempt to transcribe any voicemail so I could read it instead of listening to it. However, when I looked down at it, the words "unable to transcribe" seemed to mock me. I huffed, pressing the voicemail button, and held the phone up to my ear. Static poured from my phone like a tap, and I was just about to click the delete button on the message when I heard a voice.
992X Alpha. Subject located. Acknowledge.
The message was broken and garbled. It took a second playthrough to correctly identify what they were saying. I had no clue what the numbers at the beginning of the message meant, and as far as the rest of the message was concerned, I was at a loss. I thought perhaps one of my friends thought he'd get a laugh by sending me cryptic messages. So instead of giving him the satisfaction, I deleted the voicemail and headed home. A week flew by and I was in the middle of putting the final touches on a spreadsheet when my phone vibrated again. I had put the previous incident out of my mind by that point, but once I read unknown number, I stared blankly at it. If it was one of my friends, I wondered what they would do if I answered it. So I did. I swiped the call bar over and put the phone up to my ear. There was silence. After a few seconds, I said, "Hello?" Static began to build from the other end, and after a moment, I heard that same voice from before speaking. They said,
You are in danger. They are coming for you.
I thought this was just some joke, so I replied, "I hope they bring pizza." And with a self-induced chuckle, I hung up the phone. I went home that night and laid in bed thinking about that call from earlier. I didn't recognize the voice at all, and if one of my friends were messing with me, I wasn't sure how they were generating all that static on the other end. The following morning, as I walked out to my car sipping my coffee, I noticed something odd. There was a man standing on the corner across the street from me. He was staring at me, and when I looked up and met his gaze, he turned and began walking away. I thought about calling out to the man, but reasoned against it. It was probably just an early morning commuter who happened to look in my direction. But then I thought back to the call, and what they said. They are coming for you. I perished the thought and went to work. While I typed away at my desk, I started to get the feeling of being watched again. It was similar to earlier in the morning when that man was looking at me. I glanced out of the window that was next to me and looked down. Across the street, while countless people moved along the sidewalk, there was a person standing motionless in the crowd. They were looking up at my building. They were looking up at me. I quickly turned away and focused more intently on my work. I felt like I was just making myself paranoid, that the random calls I had received were just nonsense and it was forcing me to notice things. Maybe the guy outside wasn't actually looking at me, probably just admiring the office building. Even though I was trying to think rationally, when I got home that night, the first thing I did was make sure every door and window was locked tightly. Nothing wrong with being a little cautious. However, not long after I went to bed that night, I was awoken to the sound of footsteps coming from inside my living room. I sat up in my bed with my heart beating so loud I could hear it. I sat there, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for whoever it was to come through and attack me. But nothing happened. 10 minutes slowly ticked by and still nothing happened. I stayed awake the remainder of the night, staring at my bedroom door, too scared to investigate the noise that had woken me up. It was possible that I had just dreamed it, but it was just as possible that I didn't. I wasn't willing to take that gamble. Once the light of the morning sun peeked through my window, I slowly opened my bedroom door. I found no one in my living room. I searched around and found nothing out of place. And when I looked further, I found that all of my doors and windows were still securely locked. That brings me to a couple days ago. Dealing with these strange occurrences put a significant strain on my mental health, and I decided to take a few sick days from work. While that is partially true, the exact reason for me avoiding my job is that I had received another call. The voice on the other end took much longer to speak than usual. He said,
Stay inside. Shut your blinds. Don't open the door.
if this truly was just a prank orchestrated by a friend of mine, well, they wouldn't be a friend much longer, that's for damn sure. But the odds of someone I knew doing this to me was low, and was even lower for them to continue doing this. I sat in my living room the entire day watching TV with the volume off and the subtitles on, periodically taking a peek through my living room window. Hours crawled by and I hadn't seen a single person pass by my house, which I took as a good sign. I was beginning to wonder, why me? What did I do to cause all this? I wondered who these people were, and I wondered if this would ever end. Then, not long after the sun had set, there was a knock on my door. I shuddered as I felt the knocks reverberate through my body. I stared at the door cautiously, before slowly creeping over to my window. I gently peeled back the curtain and saw 3 men standing on my front porch. They wore long black suit coats and were wearing sunglasses. If it were anyone else, seeing them wearing sunglasses at night would be comical, but seeing these men wear them just made me nervous. I did the only thing I thought I could do at that point. I called the police. 20 minutes came and went, and there was another knock on my door. I once again peeked through the window and saw 2 uniformed officers standing outside. The 3 men from earlier nowhere to be found. I walked over to my door and rested my hand on the lock. When I did, my phone buzzed in my pocket once more. I felt my hand flinch away from the lock as I pulled my phone out and answered it. The voice on the other end spoke sternly.
Do not open the door.
This caused me to take a few steps back, and another knock sounded. I went over to my window once again and watched as the officers looked to one another, then walked away. That all happened a few days ago. I'm not sure who has been calling me or why, or who those men even were outside, but I'm beginning to run low on food. And the mystery person who has been calling me the last few weeks seems to have stopped. I'm going to have to open the door and try to get some food soon. If any of you get a strange voicemail from an unknown number, don't listen to it. Just delete it. I feel like I might have avoided all of this if I had just done that in the first place. If you don't hear from me again, well, that means they probably got me. And if that's the case, I want you all to be careful. If they can get me, well then they can just as easily get to you, too. Last night, something creepy happened at my gym. Just a quick bit of background. I, like many people, made it my New Year's resolution to get back in shape. So, I've been hitting the gym regularly since early December. I figured there was no harm in getting a head start. Unfortunately, I've had to work crazy hours this week, and by the time I get off work, the gym is already closed. That changed last night, however, when I was driving home and saw the lights were on, and that there was a sign saying now open 24/7. I had previously overheard someone complaining the other day about having to deal with nighttime vandalism lately. So I think the company figured it was cheaper to pay a minimum wage employee to cover the night shift than it was to simply hire a security guard. Anyways, I pulled up to the gym, grabbed my bag from the trunk, and headed inside. I almost turned around because there was no one at the front desk, and literally no one in the gym either. Half of the fluorescent lights were on and there was faint music playing, so I figured the employee was probably on a break or something. So I went to the locker room to get changed. I first noticed the mess when I went to start my warm-up. The free weights were scattered all over the place. Those little bolts you use to lock the weights in on the machine were scattered on the ground. The yoga mats were strewn about. The trash bins, although empty, were on their sides. The cleaning bottles had all been knocked over, and one of them was leaking over a treadmill. And there were jump ropes dangling from the pull-up bars. It looked like the gym had been opened all day and the employee had said screw it to the idea of cleaning up before closing, basically. I jumped on an elliptical and put on my headphones, knowing full well my phone battery was about to die at any minute. If I had planned on going to the gym, I obviously would have charged my phone before leaving work. Oh well, woulda, coulda, shoulda. So there I was, working out like it wasn't anybody's business, letting my mind wander. I noticed the lights would flicker from time to time, but I didn't really think much of it. Fluorescent lights flicker. It's just what they do. I was about 15 minutes into my workout when my battery finally died on me, and I was pulled out of my headspace. At least there was music playing. Some old hip-hop song I had never heard before. I migrated over to the weight machines and put the bolts in place and began lifting. Suddenly, the song skipped and started right back at the beginning. I quirked a brow, but then I saw the old CD player in the corner of the room. That would explain it. A couple minutes later, at the same point in the song, it skipped again and restarted. CD must have been scratched, I figured. When it restarted for a third time, I had had enough. I jogged over and skipped to the next track. I could have sworn I heard something in that brief silence between the songs that sounded like a whimper, but I convinced myself that it was just a side effect of a creepy, empty gym in the early hours of the morning. I went back to lifting weights, started getting really into the song, and suddenly, it started skipping and replaying the same line over and over again. Then, a few moments later, the power in the entire gym went out, but only for a second or two. To be honest, it caught me off guard and startled me. I nearly dropped the bar I was holding. The high-pitched shriek that accompanied the outage didn't help my nerves either. And no, the shriek hadn't come from me. As soon as the lights came back on and since the music had stopped, I was able to really hear the whimpers I thought I had heard earlier. They drew my attention to the supply closet near the main desk. I don't know why I grabbed a weapon, because really, it was clearly someone crying, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who it was and why they were hiding. The mess in the gym, the missing employee. Obviously, the vandals came in and scared the person working the front desk. The power outage was just a coincidence. The CD skipping was just crappy old technology doing its thing. And still, I grabbed a free weight just in case. I approached the door, gripping the weight tightly, and loudly asked, "You okay in there?" The whimpering stopped almost immediately, like the person on the other side was trying to conceal their presence. Kind of too late for that, buddy. I shrugged and opened the door, only to find, well, exactly what I thought I'd find. She looked like a student, early 20s, maybe even 19. She had an employee t-shirt and was curled up into a ball in the far corner of the closet, shaking like a leaf and cheeks stained with tears. She flinched when she saw me, and I quickly took a step back. I tossed the weight aside and lifted my hands to show her I meant her no harm. I asked if she was doing okay, and she kind of just stared at me for a few seconds before she got this glint of recognition in her eyes. She got up briskly, sped past me, but grabbed my arm as she did, and said, "We have to get out of here now." She didn't seem all that shaken for someone who had been crying seconds before. Like, she had this really intense, authoritative voice to her. I couldn't help but follow her. I tried to explain to her that I needed to change before I left, but she wouldn't hear it. She only stopped when I pointed out that I had left my car keys in my locker. Her confidence waned. I heard her whisper to herself that there was no time, but she looked like she was weighing things in her head. Okay, she decided. We'll go back together, but just in and out. We have to leave before it comes back. The word "it" caught my attention. It was a really weird choice of words to describe a vandal. As she led me to the locker room, I asked her more about it, and her anxiety became even more apparent. I can't remember what exactly I said to convince her to talk to me, or what she said verbatim, but she did eventually open up as I was trying to get my locker open. The gist of it is this. She was working the late shift, obviously. Things were going well at first. At worst, a few creeps made passes at her, but they knocked it off when she threatened to revoke their gym memberships. It was around 11 p.m. and she hadn't seen a single customer in over an hour. She was bored, so she began tidying up, washing the machines, putting the weights back in place, that kind of stuff. She was dusting the top of one of the machines when she heard one of the chest bars come crashing to the ground. She figured the last person who used it hadn't locked it up properly and put the clamps back in place. A few minutes later, the same bar fell again. This time, she put it off to the side and made a mental note to tell the manager that the equipment was broken. As she was rounding up more weights, she said she felt a breath on the nape of her neck, and thinking it was some creeper who had been hiding out in the locker room, turned on her heels and cursed at him. Except, there was no one there. The weight room was empty. That's when things really started getting creepy. She was on high alert, noticing every sound and jumping at every movement. As the minutes ticked by, things began moving. She was sure someone was running around making a mess and then running out of sight. She started looking at the mirrors to try and catch them in the act. You see, the mirrors cover 3 walls, so you can see most of the room just by looking at one wall. She caught sight of a silhouette standing on the opposite side of the gym. She described it as being dark, but without much detail to it. Like a shadow, I remember her saying. Scared but convinced she finally caught him in the act, she turned around sharply, and as she did, she saw a weight being thrown across the room, with nothing doing the throwing. The figure in the mirror was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, as though all hell had broken loose, all the equipment started shaking and stuff started falling all over the place. Weights flew past her. Bottles of cleaner hit her in the back. She then ducked into a nearby supply closet and tried to hide. She could hear objects pelting against the door, but everything inside the closet was quiet. Then, a moment later, she heard a loud knock. And suddenly, the ruckus in the rest of the gym went silent. She sat there in horror for a few minutes before she mustered the courage to leave. But something was blocking the door. She couldn't see very well out of the crack in the door, but it looked like one of the weight machines had been dragged all the way over to the closet and dropped there. Cue to her waiting in horror with the song stuck on repeat, and me around midnight entering the gym. Now, I gotta be honest, there was nothing blocking the door to the supply closet when I got there. I don't know if she imagined it or if it got moved or what. That's why I was pretty skeptical, and why I was reluctant to believe her story. It seemed a lot more likely that a bunch of vandals had just scared her. I was ready to dismiss the whole thing, but as we left the locker room and headed towards the front door, I heard the CD player turn itself back on. And then, the deafening crash of breaking glass. I ran into the gym, only to find every single floor-to-ceiling mirror shattered into pieces, with not a soul in sight who could have done it. Not even some hooligans running away like thieves in the night. The employee walked over and put a hand on my shoulder, asking me to leave. I wanted to. I really did. But I had become rooted to the ground. I swear to you, on everything I hold dear. As I stood there over hundreds of broken chunks of mirror, I could see our reflection staring back at us from every angle. And in some of them, there was a dark figure standing behind us.